It is my real pleasure and honor to welcome tonight as the first keynote speaker for this conference, Professor Nora Taylor. Nora has been a person who has worked incredibly around Southeast Asia and contemporary art, but for me in particular, her theorizing around performance art as a mode of remembrance and history has been really influential in terms of how I think about performance practices. So Nora, it's a great pleasure and an honor to have you here. And just a brief background to you, for those of you here who may not be familiar so far. Nora is the Alsdorf Professor of South and Southeast Asian Art at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. She is also the author of Painters in Hanoi, an ethnography of Vietnamese art, published by Hawaii University Press in 2004 and NUS Press then again in 2009. She is also the co-editor of Modern and Contemporary Art, an anthology from Cornell, the Southeast Asia Performance Program in 2012. Nora, I feel like Southeast Asia is missing from this title. Oh, did I miss it? How is it meant to be? Modern and Contemporary Southeast Asian Art, an anthology, as well as numerous articles and 2 edited volumes on modern and contemporary Vietnamese and Southeast Asian art. She recently co-edited an upcoming special issue of Art Journal on history as figure in the work of contemporary South and Southeast Asian artists. And Nora tonight will be giving our keynote lecture entitled Sedimented Acts, Southeast Asian Artists' Engagement with History Through Performance. Nora, I hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva and Haus der Kunst, for this wonderful invitation, and thank you for this introduction, and all of you for sticking around today. Let me do this. Southeast Asia as a region presents a challenge to art historians intent on finding written or photographic traces of artists' artworks, exhibitions prior to the 21st century. Hong Kong-based Asia Art Archive notwithstanding, which was founded in 2000 for the specific purpose of collecting materials pertaining to exhibitions and art events, collections of art historical documents in the region are rare. The disparity is not due to neglect, nor does it indicate a measure of cultural practice, but is rather the fallout from historical and political circumstances. In countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, and Singapore, historical documents have been lost or destroyed, and if they exist, they're not always trusted because they could have been falsified or biased in favor of official narratives. Most artists and historians rely instead on memory, storytelling, and rumor to authenticate and legitimate their recollections. After all of the violent political upheavals that have plagued the region, it is not surprising to find a dearth of archival records. Instead of lamenting their loss as one of nostalgia or longing, one should consider their absence or their forgetting, as Ashley Thompson observed in the case of Cambodia, to be a focus of study in itself, and consider the conditions under which they disappeared. In her argument, the erasure of a physical object or document from the past is part of the process of remembering. The history of the event or the object is embedded in its absence or deletion. Asia Art Archive also acknowledges these gaps because it could not essentially retroactively amass the materials that were lost. Asia Archive created a platform that reflects on the archiving process, a kind of living archive that does not claim to be authoritative nor comprehensive, but rather is designed to be deliberately fragmented in order to allow researchers to question these gaps and debate the very nature of an archive. Absence is thus a given in the history of Southeast Asian art. In his book Oblivion, Marc Auger wrote, "One must know how to forget in order to taste the full flavor of the present, of the moment, and of expectation. But memory itself needs forgetfulness. One must forget the recent past in order to find the ancient past again." Sorry, I suddenly got a dry mouth. One could consider this act of forgetting to illustrate what French psychoanalytic philosopher Jacques Derrida sees as a manifestation of Sigmund Freud's Wunderblock, or the magic mystic pad, the psyche's ability to remember without a recording instrument. In his series of lectures that were compiled in the book Archive Fever, he examined how a spontaneous memory is killed as soon as a recording device is used to archive it. In Derrida's view, it becomes a palimpsest, thus erasing the mind's ability to simultaneously recall what has been recorded. One may consider the same phenomenon in regards to viewing a live performance. What happens to a performance once it has been recorded or documented? Can one still recall or remember its original iteration, its liveness? Mechtild Widrich, sitting here with us today, has studied a similar phenomenon which she calls a process of monumentalization, whereby the photograph of a performance erases the original experience of the event, or a fixation of a possibly fictional interpretation of history through physical reconstruction in the present, a reconstruction that in turn is often so thoroughly documented as to make possible a continuous point of reference in opposition to the often fragmentary or sparely documented original. When appearing as an image in lieu of the real-time event, the work enters the public sphere as a remain, a relic, a fractured memory. Rebecca Schneider has also examined performance remains as a historiographic exploration, documentary encounters that occur in and within the archive. The researcher certainly, but also the art viewer, short of attending a performance live, will likely encounter an artist's work via a document. Such is the nature of art history. What interests me more is not only, as Widrich and Schneider have reflected on so well, the residue or remains of performance, but also the previous life of a performance, the historical or historiographical event that certain performance artists wish to draw attention to in their work. I have thus selected artists for this talk from 3 countries in Southeast Asia that critically examine history with a capital H in their work. I'm interested in how they call upon us viewers to think critically about the historical process, the archive as a tool and source of inspiration, the photographic and the filmic document, and the tensions between fictional time and actual time in art. The Vietnamese American War provides a case in point where photographic images have supplanted actual memories of real-time events. Viet Thanh Nguyen wrote that the war is impossible to forget, but difficult to remember. Photographs of the Vietnam War are so entrenched in the memory of the generation of television viewers and Life magazine subscribers that few have the capability of recalling what actually took place. Susan Sontag has likened this to Plato's cave, where viewers of photographs mistake them for reality. The photographs of reenactments of the Vietnam War by Vietnamese American artist Anh My Lê can be seen as operating along the same lines. Her series titled Small Wars, dated from 1999 to 2002, captured men who spend their weekends reenacting battles from the Vietnam War in the forests of Virginia. According to the catalog of an exhibition of her photographs that took place in Chicago, while her pictures present men, some of them veterans, others history buffs, as they simulate combat and war routines using detailed props such as grounded airplanes, tents, and uniforms, the images do not include the glaring anachronisms that may have been present. It is the landscape that provides the most telltale signs of falsehood. The flora is typical of North American pine and oak forest, nothing like the dense tropical jungle that covers much of Vietnam. Lê was often asked to participate in the reenactments, her ethnicity presumably adding an element of authenticity to the make-believe. She performed for the male audience that became, in actuality, her real subject. Sensitive to the fact that what motivates such men is often a complex web of psychological need, fantasy, and a passion for history, Lê did not make a mockery of their actions. The ambiguity of Lé's photographs raises questions about the reliability of seemingly objective historical accounts, such as news photographs, which greatly influence how war is communicated and remembered. She uses a large format camera that recalls early war photography, such as Civil War photographers who were interested in achieving a level of clarity and craftsmanship to heighten the sense of direct reportage. Many of those photographs arranged some of their scenes aesthetically, thus pointing to the history of war imagery that blends reality and artifice, that is precisely Anne Millet's goal in photographing not real combat, but staged battles. Lé's photographs might fall under Carrie Lambert Beatty's definition of the parafictional, or art projects that have one foot in the field of the real and one foot in the fictional. In parafiction, she explains, real and or imaginary personages and stories intersect with the world as it is being lived. A 2-channel video work titled The Guerrillas of Cu Chi, made by the Ho Chi Minh City collective The Propeller Group, composed of 3 artists, Phunam Thuc Ha, Tuan Andrew Nguyen, and Matt Lucero, can also fall under this category. The film installation consists of a 1963 Hanoi-produced propaganda documentary facing, on the opposite wall, a film taken by the 3 artists of tourists conducting target practice at the same site's shooting range that provides an ironic twist to the blurring of the lines between fact and fiction and the way in which the war in Vietnam has been represented. The tunnels of Cu Chi, an intricate 121-kilometer-long underground complex of chambers and passageways, were part of the Viet Cong's weapons of defense, one of their most successful strategies in eluding the air raids and bombs dropped by US forces during the decades of war between the 2 countries. They are among the most popular tourist destinations in Vietnam today. The irony is not lost on the artists, whose work often plays with the slippery boundaries between reality and fiction, that the real site is now a playground for tourists to shoot fake bullets, and the real footage of the real soldiers hiding underground is placed across it as if it were the fake targets of the tourist game and was a prop for a stage reenactment instead of the real deal. These artists play with iconic representations of the war and the way that it is remembered. For as much as the war has been played over and over again, it continues to haunt the living. For this reason, artwork pertaining to the war can be seen as an act of repair for the survivors. By reviving them through what essentially can be considered reenactments, they serve to remedy the past, or at least to rethink it. As Rebecca Schneider has suggested, resuscitating past events, bringing them back to life, so to speak, reanimating them through performance reenactments and performance remains, recall a method of historiography through ritual. Schneider considers performance a means of rethinking historiography as event, and a series of documentary encounters that occur in and within the archive. History, she says, is a set of sedimented acts, which are not the historical acts themselves, but the act of securing any incident backward. They are both commemorative and critical of the processes of verifying historical memory, because they serve, as Jane Blocker has also argued, as unorthodox historical methodologies that are not about the archive, but are the archive. By inserting them in contemporary art contexts, they also disrupt standard notions of temporality and location. When performance art first appeared as an art form in Vietnam, it was not the result of an evolutionary process from modernism to contemporary, nor was it a case of imitation of Western art practices. Rather, it was precisely the outcome of a kind of absence, the absence of infrastructure, of funding, and the lack of an art art public. So now I'm going to turn to performance art per se. So the first performance events that were, the first performance events in Vietnam were poorly documented. So short of falling into oblivion, most of these performance works are remembered thanks to either hearsay or snapshots, some of which have taken a life of their own, akin to the monumentalization described by Widrich. In January 1997, when Chen An Quan and Nguyen Van Thien staged a performance on the campus of the 15th century Confucian Temple of Literature in Hanoi, also known as Vietnam's first university, painting and sleeping on straw mats and tying themselves together with ropes, their actions were not immediately recognized as art. They, quote unquote, performed for 3 days before the police came and arrested them for trespassing. Rumors about the artists' actions circulated widely in the art world. Upon looking at the photographs that the artists circulated in a small pocket-sized album of prints, which was the way in which artists used to share photos in coffee shops and artists' homes before Facebook, many were confused at the nature of the installation, but were more upset that the artists were caught in what could be considered a criminal act. Actions in the name of art such as this had rarely been performed in Vietnam, so the confusion was understandable. But because it occurred in a public space, it gave performance art a reputation for mischief. In a society that had already created mechanisms for regulating art activities, this provided the authorities an opportunity to distrust this new art form, the new art form of performance art. The precarious nature of performance art is a condition that is shared across Southeast Asia, and I'll return to this with my other examples. For now, it's interesting to analyze the aftermath of the event, the photographs that were taken, and how the event was remembered. There are only a few photographs of the installation that have been saved by the artist, and they were eventually placed on a blog by Nguyen Van Thien, one of the artists, who took the name after the performance to Tien Van Mu after the site. Since there was no audience, technically speaking, attending the performance is represented and embodied by the photographs. The photograph of the artists tied to each other near a tree seems especially poignant, as it seemed to foreshadow the artist's arrest. In the photograph, the artists are wearing surgical masks and appear to be wrapped around the tree, although actually that's just an illusion. The rope is wound rather loosely around the artists, as if they had just casually looped it around themselves and not secured it very tightly. The masks suggest that they have been silenced or silenced themselves, and the rope alluded to being imprisoned or reined in and demobilized. Could the artist be illustrating government censorship of the arts? The blog includes a somewhat badly written or poorly translated text by Patrick Raslenberg that refers to the desacralization of the Temple of Literature and the artist's critical engagement with the site itself. The author writes, "The above action renders ineffective the place occupied by the Temple of Literature in national history, demanding the spectators another view in their much more valiant effort to approach the work of art. And thus the two artists have broken the system of ideas ruled by the state, because the state has the monopoly in the determination of the Temple of Literature's meaning." The author seems to be stating then that the artists selected the Temple of Literature in order to engage with its meaning, and thus were in dialogue with it or rebelled against it. And it is true that in the rumors that spread about the artist's actions, few mentioned its exact location. The site of the Temple of Literature could be more or less significant. The artists actually didn't say, but what is equally important is that it did not take place in a gallery or an art space. They didn't also stage it on the street or in a crowded public space. They chose a park, a garden, a national landmark, a sanctuary, where they could essentially go both both unnoticed and on display. Because they photographed the event, the goal was essentially to have an audience, or the semblance of an audience, at least, and draw attention, if not to the Temple of Literature as a monument, to performance art itself and to them as artists. While the perception that performance art was somehow tied to illicit activities may have adversely affected some artists afraid to go against the state, it had the opposite effect for others, intent on challenging official discourse on art. This may be why performance art after the mid-1990s became the dominant art form for rebellious artists. Chen Lung, a painter, for example, began to incorporate installation and performance into his practice as early as 2000. A strong voice in opposition to government control over art and culture, he developed a performance work that could be interpreted as a critique of communism. Variously titled Red Scarf, Welts, and Laploi, it consisted in the artist inviting audience members to lash his back with a wet red scarf, the kind worn by young pioneers or communist youth. The artist related how he and his classmates would play games in schoolyards, whipping each other with a scarf. He developed this work not as a sign of nostalgia, but rather as means of teaching his own son about the perils of falling prey to communist indoctrination. The actions of thrashing his body would create marks or welts on his body, a temporary scar, reminding him of the memory of having once been educated in Marxist-Leninism. So for the purposes of this talk, rather than belabor the point of his performance, it suffices to say that Quan and Tien's performance in Van Mieu, the memory of the event stayed way beyond the event itself. In Lung's case, as a mark on his body, but for Quan and Tien as a rumor and a photograph. In May 2005, in Yangon, Myanmar, two artists staged a performance in public on the streets of the capital. Titled Mobile Art Gallery and Mobile Market, the work entailed peddling cheap drawings and inexpensive household objects to passers-by. In 2005, the military junta had a firm grip on citizens, and artists were sorely lacking materials for art making. They made art from whatever they could find at hand. The idea behind the performance was to protest currency inflation and price increases by selling goods at old prices. Choi hawked combs and makeup for pennies and gave back change in expired chat bills, while Thanh Linh sold small watercolor paintings on paper at equally low prices. Similar to the Hanoi artist's performance, the Yangon Artists' small market stalls were not immediately recognized as an artistic gesture and drew the attention of the public, who expressed interest and gratitude in the artist's gesture of empathy towards injustices suffered by the public. The artists managed to elude the authorities, but then were eventually followed and interrogated by the police. Thanh Linh had reason to fear the police, as he had already been incarcerated as a political prisoner between 1998 and 2004. During the 6.5 years that he spent behind bars, he was not permitted to paint, but he managed to produce several hundred paintings secretly, using white cotton prison uniforms painted with cigarette lighters, syringes, or his hands in lieu of paintbrushes. While in political exile, he also developed a performance art practice, mostly due to the lack of materials for art making, but also because performance art allowed him to express himself without words. Both Thanh Linh and Choi went into exile after their 2005 performance. Choi traveled to the US thanks to a grant from the Asian Cultural Council, and Thanh Linh emigrated to the UK. It took new elections and a series of reforms for them to feel safe enough to return. But politics stayed with their art and their performances since. Choi performed waterboarding and impersonated Dawn Aung San Suu Kyi, while Thanh Linh had been making plaster casts of the hands of political prisoners and carved prison soap bars. and both made works in response to the saffron revolution of 2008. Mobile Art Gallery and Mobile Market were not the first works of performance art in Yangon. In 1983, before the term relational aesthetics was coined, the Burmese artist Sun Min invited an audience to share a meal before a painting of a street hawker serving Chinese noodles. I really tried hard, but I don't have a photograph of this. And at the same year, Popo walked on the grounds of Yangon University with his thoughts written on his jacket. But Tainlin and Choi's actions received more attention because they performed them at a time of extreme hardship and frustration after decades of repression. Not to undermine Popo and Sun Min's actions, nor is it productive to compare the Hanoi of 1997 with the Yangon of 2005, but it is interesting to note some parallels between the Venmu and the Mobile Art Gallery and Mobile Market performances. One could say that the conditions for art making were similar. It's not surprising that two clandestine performances made an imprint on the art historical memory of the two countries. It's not so much the works themselves that became memorable, neither their form nor their visual quality, since neither were very elaborate, but it's precisely the lack of sophistication and documentation that left much to the imagination and space for rumor, contention, and polarity that gave them prominence. Unlike the high visibility of Rikrit Tirvanit's Pad Thai cooking events or Lwin, and this is in homage to him who recently passed away, his Yellow Man performances, these two works fell completely under the radar of the art world outside of Burma and Vietnam because they were not intended to have wider audiences. A few photographs and low-tech footage remain of these works for scholars such as myself to discuss, but these documents are mostly superfluous. The true documents were their lore, the verbal transmission, the gossip that ensued. Before the advent of social media, artists had no means of sharing their news or announcements of their artistic events other than word of mouth or the mail. But before the turn of the century, hanging out was the foundation of the Southeast Asian art world. It was both a practice and a method of communication, information sharing, and developing discourses surrounding art. Karen Zitzowitz has also pointed this out in relation to India. Studying the talk in the air as art is made and circulated allows us to unpack key questions of value while focus on the relationship of talk to particular works of art will maintain an analytical connection between social formations and artistic practice. Art talk, she contends, forms an everyday art historical archive. The last place I would like to visit is Singapore, where on New Year's Eve, 1993 to 1994, the artist Joseph Ng performed a work in protest against a police raid on a homosexual cruising district and the arrest of 12 men. The men were sentenced to 3 strokes of cane. Ng called his work Brother Cane to suggest the government's close watch on its citizens. Aside from video footage taken by the American and then Singapore-based artist Ray Langenbach, and a few photographs by audience members, no documentation of the performance exists. Instead, what remains is the snapshot of the artist with his back turned to the audience, his briefs lowered. The photograph shows the artist performing an act for which he was fined and charged with obscenity. News of Ng's arrest sent ripples through the Singaporean art community. In 1994, Singapore still had no contemporary art center. Performance art had been introduced in the late 1980s, however, by Tang Da Wu, an artist who, upon his return from studying in England, founded the Artist Village, a community of studios and exhibition spaces located in an abandoned kampong the Malay word for village. The lay artist Lwin was introduced to performance art there as well. And from 1988 until 1994, experimental art thrived in these clandestine circuits because, according to Wan Linghui, the government did not care. As he stated, quote, ironically, the arts flourished during the 1980s up to the early 1990s precisely because of the pragmatic Philistine modernity promoted by the government. Singapore society, in its mercantile, industrial-oriented indifference to the artsy, crafty, allowed space for artistic growth. As such, growth generally was not considered important enough to warrant attention. In other words, when the government didn't care, artists had more freedom, even though there were no institutions for exhibiting contemporary art. It was not until contemporary art began to matter economically that the government sponsored the building of contemporary art institutions, but also exercised, therefore, much more control. This is not exactly the same as in Vietnam. Like Brother Kane, many of the artist village events went undocumented. Aside from Ray Langenbach's video recording of Brother Kane, one other person took it upon himself to photograph and collect documents pertaining to art events in the artist village and beyond. Artist and archivist Ko Nguyen Hao was working at the National Museum in 1985 when he heard Tang Da Wu give a presentation about contemporary art. He recorded the talk in order to learn from it, but then soon realized that nobody else was keeping records of art events in the country. The National Archives collected political events, not cultural events, and there were no art institutions other than the artist village. So inadvertently, he became the de facto chronicler of the 1980s and 1990s art world. Far from being comprehensive, the material that he amassed, which includes now some 8,000 documents, is at times the only trace of a particular exhibition or performance. With the material that he has accumulated, he took the role of a researcher, the kind of go-to person for information about Singapore art history, but also a fact checker. In fact, I received an email from him yesterday telling me I got something wrong. So Annie probably is laughing because she knows exactly what he was talking about. Whether he can be called a hoarder because he stores the documents in his tiny government-owned HDB flat, or a historian, he has turned his archiving into what can only be called an artistic or a performative practice. I'll give an example. In 2004, he presented a work as part of an exhibition organized by the independent curatorial collective P10 to showcase some of the knowledge that he had accumulated. Titled Errata, curator Woon Tien Wei described the exhibition as inspired by Ko's brand of empirical formula in his research of Singapore art. The exhibition is based on an error in print or in writing to be contested in the book Channels and Confluences, A History of Singapore Art by Kwok Kan Chow, published by the National Heritage Board, Singapore Art Museum in 1996, end quote. The impetus for the show was an error that Ko spotted, a misattributed date for a key painting in the history of Singapore art. The painting in question, National Language Class by Chua Mia T, was erroneously dated 1950 when it was in fact painted in 1959. So he titled his work Errata, page 71, plate 47, image caption, change year 1950 to year 1959, reported September 2004 by Ko Nguyen Hao. P10 deliberately omitted the title of the book, and according to Woon Tien Wei, to give it a bit of ambiguity. In the brochure printed by P10 on the occasion of the exhibition, Tien Wei further states that the exhibition charts the unraveling of Singapore art history as we know it, as a result of Ko's archaeological finds as he excavates the ruins left behind or forgotten. The status of this erratum is pending but not final. History needs the confluences of dialogues and perpetual reorderings to maintain its relevance to the times. In pointing out such a seemingly minute error in what essentially was the first book on Singapore art history to be published since the opening of the Singapore Art Museum, written by the director of that institution, no less, Errata undermined the authority of the museum and its ability to write an authoritative art history. Errata gave Ko the opportunity to legitimize his own archiving process and classify it as a work of art. It gave his archive a name, the Singapore Art Archive Project, or SAAP, in 2005, and a purpose: to construct a meta-narrative of Singapore art history. In my own discussions with him, Ko also stated that Errata showed that archival materials can speak for a work, but he admits that they can also speak wrongly. They simply provide another view. But more importantly, it drew attention to the painting in question, National Language Class, as it prompted an opportunity for a public discussion about the artist and the subject of the work, the language education policies in post-independence Malaya. The error in the date was by no means trivial. 1959 was a far more important date in Singapore art history, as it marked the election of Lee Kuan Yew as Prime Minister. In 2014, Ko was invited as an artist in residence at the Nanyang Technological University's Center for Contemporary Art, where he presented his archive in various formats, perpetually sorting them, presenting them thematically and chronologically to the public. In May 2015, he had a show at the Jendala Art Gallery of photographs that he reprinted from his own collection. One of them features Ray Langenbach and others standing outside the appellate court where the hearing for Joseph Ng's obscenity charge took place. Historical artifact, artist's photograph, or performance relic, the picture becomes a substitute for the artist's presence and witnessing of an event. We can look at these performances of documents and documents of performances as alternative forms of historiography. In places where institutions are unreliable, where notions of the truth are somewhat ambiguous, performance and aesthetic practices create critical platforms for debates about the past. This is made evident in Joshua Oppenheimer's film, The Act of Killing, where the performative not only recalls brutal historical acts, but also serves as a discursive act of remembering. Like Chan Leung's red scarf lacerations in Lap Loi, performance awakens memories of trauma and returns the artist and the viewer to a past experience. This phenomenon may be likened to what Joan Gibbons has described as post-memory, which provides ideological and political alternatives to previous historicizations of the past. Post-memory is the inheritance of past events or experiences that are still being worked through. Post-memory carries an obligation to continue that process or working through over the event or experience that is not yet in the process of reply. However, as with counter-history and counter-memory, post-memory is still a type of social memory that has been inhabited in the memories of the primary witnesses of the previous generation. So could these performances, in the absence of more complete and less fragmented documentation, serve the new generation of performance artists in Southeast Asia with a memory from which to draw and learn from and reformulate new histories? Thank you. I don't know where you want me to go. Should we all sit here? Okay.
Thank you so much. We were asked to briefly introduce ourselves. We are the respondents / moderators for the discussion section. My name is Mechtild Widrich. I teach at the School of the Art Institute, and I'm a performance scholar.
I'm Chương-Đài. I'm the researcher for Southeast Asia at Asia Art Archive. So we have all the documentation that Nora talked about, and a lot of the documentation from the other papers as well. So I'll start. What I like to do is to pick up on some of the themes of the previous two panels and to tie it to what Nora covered, and perhaps to ask a question about how to write art history in Southeast Asia, which I know all of us have struggled with, right? But I think for me, the panels and your keynote was very helpful in reminding us about the social aspect of how to write this art history, right? Several of the papers touched on notions of publicness, action. Amanda's Rath's paper talked about objects as an extension of the body. And so for me, all of these papers touch on how performance, we can think about it not just in terms of the centrality of the performer, but of the essential role of the audience, whether that audience is a live audience or the audience to be, right? And I think that's what's so interesting, that the performance has many afterlives, right? And so the public itself is always constellated. And I think that also blurs the idea of space as just a physical place, but we can also think about space as a social relationship, right? And for me, this resonates in what you were talking about, Nora, how the performance at Bang Miu circulated in the small photo album, right? And so that photo album became an exhibition space, a platform in which the performance lived on, right? And I think that really, perhaps for me, is a way to think about how to write art history about Southeast Asia, because the conventional way of writing art history is you rely on documents. They're our badges of truth, right? But here you can't rely on documents. Like you said, you have to rely on oral histories, on conversations, on rumors. And again, that points back to the importance of the social relationships that constellate this world of performance, and also the hanging out. Right? So I wanted to ask if you could talk more about that, and perhaps people in the audience would also have comments about that. Right.
Should I do that now? Sure. Yeah, thank you, Chương-Đài, and yeah, hanging out, or choi hua si, as they say in Vietnamese. I mean, it speaks to my own experience, or I'll speak to my own experience in the 1990s of doing research in Vietnam when there was no book of Vietnamese art history outside of Vietnam. Of course, there were some books, but the books that you found in Vietnam were like one photograph, one page, and there was bios of artists, and that was it. There was no analysis and nothing. So I really had to get all of my information from artists, and I use the word hanging out and not interviewing very deliberately, because at the time, interviewing artists meant asking them questions and acting kind of like a journalist, and they would have never trusted me if I acted like a journalist, because this was a time period when shortly before, Vietnamese were not even allowed to have any interactions with foreigners, or they would be reported to the police in the 1980s. So journalists were not allowed to come into Vietnam, and question people without a government interpreter, and the interpretation was often falsified and so forth. So I was not going to be a journalist. So I was not coming with recording devices or even paper questionnaires. I just literally just spend time hanging out, talking, hanging out some more, drinking beer, eating, hanging out some more, and so forth. And it wasn't even studio visits, but it was because that was the only way I would get information. But it wasn't as though I had information that I wanted to get, that I knew I could get it through that means. It was more the other way around. It was that I learned that I could get information from hanging out only after the process of hanging out. Because initially I didn't even think that was my method. I thought I would go to the museum, and then in the afternoon I would meet artists and just talk to them. But then I would go back to the museum. I was still intent on the museum was going to be the place where I would get the information. It's only way later that I realized I got much more information from the artist than I did the museum. So I didn't have any intention in that way. So I don't know if this answers your question, but as far as the writing of art history, it's a really good point to make, because of course, before the text, there is this kind of hanging out, and then there's the text. So the text came after the text, my text, but then other texts come. So now you can't actually replicate this form of hanging out. That is no longer a viable actually option for research, because now we have all of these texts. And the document exists in other forms, in either artists, now being able to document more, and they have access to documentation technology like cameras that they didn't have before. But they still rely on rumor and gossip, because my texts are constantly being debated among artists. Like, Nora said this and it's false, and she doesn't have the truth. I have the truth. And so which is fine with me, because it means that the text still becomes a site of contestation in the true form of what the hanging out was, which is you debate, you discuss, you talk, and there's still an unreliability of the document. So it's not that the document is unreliable in relation to a truth, but more like the truth is being written by this process of contestation and competition for different memories. And that's a kind of historiography that interests me. But how do you write an art history based on that? That's a big question.
Well, I think if I can just follow up, because your last example, Errata.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, if we were able to let go of this idea of the written art history as this site of truth, and I do think that has a lot to do with the institutionalization that we all have to deal with, right? The Errata is a great model for thinking about how to write art history, that it is a process of contestation, right? But also it can be a process of generosity, right? That we recognize that all of these documents either were destroyed or didn't exist in the first place, and so it relies on multiple people, telling us of this history, right? And so, is it possible for us to think about other models of writing art history? Right?
Yeah, good question. No.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I was wondering, so how do performance and history interact in your narrative? And you're saying it's complicated, which of course is always the most interesting relationship status, so that's good. So there's, performance, which has already its own complicated history to its documentation. There's also historiography, there's artistic practice in a particular historical context, and then the sources themselves, as you say, have their own complicated relationship to history. They're making history, but they're obviously, again, not don't have a direct relationship to the truth. And so I thought I would like to tie that back to a question that came up earlier about action. You asked the question, actually, what is an action? Where's the action? Maybe I want to rather ask, where does it point to? And ask specifically about the power of the body in this action, because we're talking about performance versus performativity a little bit, it seems, where performance is very much related to a body, but performativity is that, term coming out of linguistics that relates more to changing a social situation or even a political situation, and there's a lot of that in your history, in your narrative, let's say, about performance in Southeast Asian art. But then there seems something specific still about the body, which, however, is not the opposition to history or the text either, right? Because the body comes in the rumor, in the narrative, so there's like something textual, but it still runs through the body. Then there's the social relationship that seems important, but it's not an essentialist body. Is it a historical body? Is there something where history intersects on the body? How would you see it?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, because of course I was talking about instances where the performance action took place already, and then I wasn't talking about it as it was taking place in action, but rather the aftermath. So but it's a really important question, because it could lead to discussions about the body in relation to the state, to the government, which a lot of these performances were exactly what they were about. But it's almost like then you're making me think that the fact that these performances live on only through these elusive means that perhaps there is a resistance to having the state own that body, and so they're trying to avoid that, and they have to make it their own. So make it their own artistic practice, but they have to preserve it, and the way to preserve it is to document it on their own. So the live action event, of course, in the case of Van Mew, it was interesting is that it was not recognized as an art event, and so they had a lot of freedom because of that. It's only afterwards that it got recognized as an art event, but then by then they had already kind of eluded the police, so they, again, were free from the state co-opting their body. But they, in tying themselves up, they also did, of course, think about that, knowing that they are the possession of the state in some way. And Chen Lung, of course, he thinks about the body in that way as well. So I didn't even use that word, but that's, of course, key word, the body. And does that relationship of the body and the state live on through the documents? I don't know, it's a good question. Yeah. I mean, in case of Errata, we're not talking about a body, but it's also is the body, the one who is identifying the error, and it's a key error because it's a key date in the history of Singapore art. So he is embodying that, relationship to the state as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Should we open it up already? Yeah, I think Eva has a question. And then, yeah. Is there a mic? Is there a mic somewhere? Okay. Yes, there's a mic.
Thank you very much for the talk, Nora, and thank you very much for the responses, Chương-Đài and Mechtild. I have heard a previous talk by you, Nora, which was entitled Performance as Site of Memory. And I'm interested at what point this change came from referring to performance as site to performance as sediment, because they have a slightly different connotation. Site, for me, when you gave that previous talk in London, was also invoking something active and creative, kind of, and still living, like performance being the thing that actually creates history and creates certain memories within Southeast Asia. and now you've shifted to Sediment. So I would be interested to know from you how this shift came about, or is that something also to do with you now thinking more about archives and their relationships, or?
Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe the dust has settled and sedimented a little bit. Well, I think because I was thinking about history more, and I've been looking at things that are rather than memory. I think with that talk, I was arguing the difference between memory and history. That one, you're right, was more alive, but I've been thinking more about the actual documentation. I think that's what it is, and kind of fixated on what are those documents and relics and fragments of history that in looking at other works, like including Anne Millet or Propeller Group, these were artists that were not part of that London talk at all, where reenactment, but reenactment through photographs or film, and so they're more removed from the live, they're much more removed from the memory, but they are to recall the memory. And so I was just becoming more interested in what is exactly the historiographical process then, because if it's so fragmented and you are trying to build not just a history but a historiography, which you need to look at documents, then I think I was distancing myself much more from the actual live action event. I think that's what happened. But
Susanne Bieber had a question.
Thanks. Yes, I had a question in terms of expanding the notion of performance into activism. And the question is, in particular, if there is kind of even this notion of, well, some of the truths can be purposefully falsified. So with the Errata project, for example, did he give any evidence that actually the date is 1959? Or could there also be the possibility of saying, well, we are changing it to 1959, or I'd like to change it to 1959, to give it exactly that more political surrounding or that political meaning. So, and I guess there's then a question also of, particularly us as art historians, how much are we willing to write an activist art history that kind of also, uses selectively material. Falsifying material might be, of course, going a little far, but of course, I think when you also talk about some of the photographs and them being falsified, that is kind of, something that just takes place within the broader historical social context in Southeast Asia. So I would be interested if that's something to think about.
Well, with the case of Errata, the painting was made in 59. I mean, there's not contestation over the date of the painting. It's what he focused on was there was an error in the printing that made it 50, not 59. I don't think that anybody disputes that the date of the painting. What is interesting is that the artist Kong Wang Hao chose to make the focus that error, make a new project out of the error, rather than just say, excuse me, you were wrong in there. So that's also this, sedimented acts kind of, that I was thinking of the title, this difference from memory. So it's not just Ko's memory in this case, Errata, because the artist dated his painting, but he becomes an active agent in pointing to the error and making a kind of the error and the retelling, the false date or the false retelling of that painting, something. So that's kind of what that is about. As far as activism, you're right, of course, a lot of people are interested, scholars are interested in activism in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian art. There have been exhibitions of Southeast Asian art that focus on the political, and But there have also been critiques of looking at Southeast Asian art that way, to only look at the political, because there have been some scholars who say that when you do that, you're also, it's a new form of kind of essentialism. It's like making it seem as though our artists from Southeast Asia are subject to repressive regimes, and they are, victims of that repressive regime and nothing else. So it's not giving a full picture of artistic practice. It's reductive. It's reducing their artwork to politics. And so there's a resistance to doing that, but at the same time, you're right, there are artists who are using art to contest the government. There's no denying that. I mean, we have, you could call Aramayani an activist artist if you want, where it's not that they're contesting their government, but they're engaged with political issues that are taking place in their country because there's so much injustice and unfairness, and so artists are the first to kind of speak out against injustices. But as far as writing an activist art history, that's still another remove from the artist. That means that the author of that art history might actually take a stance and say, I'm going to be not just talking about the artists who are activists, of which there are many, but I'm going to be an activist in writing art history, which is a subtle difference, actually, because then I'm going to be using artworks to make statements that are maybe separate from the artwork's intended content. So I don't think, just to loop this back to Cohen, Haus, Errata, I don't think he was being activist in doing that. He was not taking an activist strategy in pointing out the error. I think he's actually kind of complex. I've been seeing him as a kind of a performance artist, because if you listen to him retell this history of Singapore art through documents, he performs it. He takes the stage, he has a public, he has an audience, he talks very freely about, and he's very selective about what he talks about, and the documents are triggers for him. So he doesn't tell the story of Singapore from A to Z. He looks at a document and then he'll tell you all kinds of things around that document, and that's what triggered him, post-Madeleine or something. You can show him something. So the Errata was more of that trigger. That was a trigger for him or someone even used the word script, that was his script or his cue. I know that date is wrong, so I'm going to be the authority. And as I said, he's kind of contesting, therefore, the authority of the museum and its publication, and being the authoritative person in this particular situation. But I don't think he's trying to get at Singapore, the founding of Singapore by Lee Kuan Yew, or trying to make a statement about Singapore politics overall. It's just a small, minute instance for him. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I press you here even further? Would you then, if you attempt a formalist reading, let's take politics out for a second, of that particular piece or of any other piece, would you would you want to attempt that? Because there was a very political reading in the pieces, but now I am actually getting very interested in the formal development, and why is the layout particularly interesting? How would you read it? Does it tie to other formal interests at the moment in the art world?
That's interesting. You mean Errata
or even
itself,
performance and archive, performance and documents seem to play a role. And obviously, I'm reductive here, in the other direction. But I'm just wondering if you had any.
I
thoughts
think
on
it's
that.
definitely a project I would have to need more than this talk to pursue. But you're right that I think it's a really good direction to go into, because, as I said, it's becoming problematic to reduce these things to political acts and by the artists, but in fact they deserve more. And so I think even with Van Mew performance, which gets reduced even in people's gossip and memory. They're like, oh, they were arrested, therefore. And you've probably heard so many Vietnamese artists saying, oh, that performance, that was, censored. And it doesn't go beyond that. And then they actually deserve more than that. They deserve more than to be reduced to, oh, they were arrested. Same with Chai and Ten Lin, the mobile art market. There's so much going on there, There's how they walked the streets and what they were exactly selling, and how they made choices. They made very deliberate choices in that performance that deserves more than just, oh, they were arrested after that. And I think with the Van Mew, it's the same. Like, look at the way they tied themselves around and so forth. And some Vietnamese artists would laugh at me if I did that, because to them it is reduced to it's just a photograph that they passed around, and they were criminalized for it because they were arrested for trespassing, and that's it. They don't see any redeeming value beyond that, and somewhere no aesthetic choice was made. But I would disagree. I think you're right. And same with Ko and
Thomas
Errata.
wants to say something about that.
No, but same with Errata. I think it's very interesting how it was exhibited, like how P10 chose to exhibit it without naming the name of the painting and focusing on Ko, actually. Yeah.
This one? Yes. I'd like to provoke a little bit, though, because for me, part of the comparison with Ko and then Lwin, I think misses an opportunity. And it misses that opportunity both of the two questions that were asked. One is the body, and the other one is the activism. Because Lwin was an artist who was very much an activist, and Lwin was very much an artist who was about the body. So I almost feel that that part of your paper is distracting into another mode, which is your research and your connection to that research with Ko, and wanting to raise him to a level that he feels respect, which I allow him to have. But of course, I mean, for me, Ko feels, in that sense, compared to Lwin, a little bit rhetorical. And with that art and activism, which is very present in Asia, I also think that coming from a Euro-American perspective, I mean, activism as state and politics, I think we should provoke that idea as well. It's the political aspects of the body, and the other one, which is the big, I mean, I hardly see it described in terms of our relationship to artists and art coming out of everything from the 50s until now, is the environment. A lot of artists that we know were activists are also dealing with environmental issues. And maybe just as our relationship with the environment has been problematic since the 70s, our relationship with artists that touch upon the environment have been problematic as well. Just provoking a little bit.
No, you're absolutely right, Thomas, and I didn't mean to, first of all, compare Lwin to Ko. The subject of this talk was not Lwin. He happened to pass away before, I kind of put him in there as a homage to him because Ko, of course, has documents of Lwin. I don't mean to not talk about Lwin deliberately, but it's just sort of, that was not the subject of this. But you're right, I could have invoked Lwin when Mechtild asked about the body. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And activism as well. So you're right to bring that up. But I don't want you to think that I was trying to undermine or deliberately avoid Lwin. Please, this wasn't the topic of this talk. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I know. I just want you to. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Well, can I add? I think that the question doesn't have to be about focusing either on the formal aspects or on activism, right? I mean, the case of Lwin is it was both. Right? He was trained in drawing and painting, and he thought about his body, he thought about performance as image making, and he thought about drawing as the most basic time-based medium, right? But at the same time, his performances were very much about politics and protest, right? I think also Errata, one of the things with Errata is perhaps we can also remember that the context of the history of performance art in Singapore and the contentious relationship between artists and institutions. Right? And I think that here Ko is also performing the right of the artists to write that history, given how the state first instituted a de facto ban on performance art, and then in many ways co-opted or appropriated the work of artists in creating spaces in which artists could perform, right, even when they were under surveillance. Yeah, and so I don't think Errata is free of politics, but at the same time, I don't think to acknowledge that larger context is to reduce his work in the aesthetics aspects as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, you're right, yeah.
Thank you so much. And now I have a quite related question. I'm very much interested from where this performance culture becomes a real thing. I mean, a part of social, economical, and political issues, which you clearly stated in your lecture and then in the discussion now. There were some sort of performativities which these artists looked at, coming from cultural history. I mean, religious rituals or theatrical art, from which they got inspired in order to organize and practice their performance.
You're asking that whether there were those, yeah. I would say, okay, so in the case of the Vietnamese artists, not necessarily, even though it's ambiguous because of course they chose to perform in a site that is a Confucian temple, but Confucius was not about visual, it was more about text and poetry and writing, at least in education in Vietnam. There were no visual illustrations of Confucianism. It has to do with social norms and poetry and that kind of thing. But the artists in contemporary performance artists in Vietnam would disagree with you. They would not claim to be inspired by anything pre-20th century. In fact, they would reject that because they want something new and something different, something that is not tied to traditional art, break away from those things or the way they talk. They want to use their bodies. They don't want to have the weight of something. And there were a lot of discussions when the word performance art had to be used in Vietnamese. And in fact, I was there at a time when they changed performance for like spectacles, like Chin Zien, and it's like dance and singing and so forth, to Biu Zien, and that is, to to present. And there's a lot of debate over what does this word mean, and so they're still trying to figure out like what makes this kind of art form different from the other performances. So maybe there's something that they could have gotten from those art forms, but they never would claim that they did. And it's very hard to draw a direct connection between them because they really, really wanted to do something just with their own bodies, sometimes with minimal props. A lot of them were introduced to performance art by a Japanese artist named Seiji Shimoda, who came and did workshops in Vietnam because Vietnam had been closed off from the contemporary art world. And he showed them that you can do performance with a pencil or something like that. And that appealed to them because it was so simple. So it was not complicated. So they didn't feel like, oh, it was almost liberating. They didn't come with like all of these thousands of years of theater and ritual and so forth. And Vietnam is a communist country, so religion, that wouldn't be so much something that they would look at. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nora. It's such a pleasure to hear your paper. And thank you so much to respondents as well for keeping the discussion going. I just wanted to loop back into the comment about Quang Haus' Errata project, and then also the discussion of like whether it's political or we look at the formal aspect of it. And thinking in particular of that specific context of Singapore, not just of the ban of performance art or de facto ban of performance art, but also the very, how do I put this? A certain particular government regime that has also, recently, because we know there were documents that were redacted, and Operations Cold Store and Spectrum have now come to light. So in terms of even just history, as civic history, we're also discovering what is truth, what's not truth right now. And I wonder whether perhaps when we think about the formal aspects of Quang Haus' work, that project, and even maybe like a performance artist such as Silan Pillay, he's actually using the instruments of knowledge as the formal aspect of the work, because like Silan's performance, he takes a mirror and he goes and stands in front of the parliament, signifying the fact that on his birthday, 32 years old, being 32 years old, he's commenting on one of the prisoners that was held without trial for 32 years, and then of course then he gets arrested and he gets convicted and gets he was given a choice, either you pay I think like $8,000 or go to prison, and he chose to go to prison. Then he goes to prison for 2 weeks, comes out, and on the day that he steps out of prison, he announces to the press, now my performance is complete. So he's using the very state apparatuses of knowledge and civic management against the system itself. So I wonder also then when I think also to some degree Rayan's work and Zihan's work, whether that is a particular strand of aesthetic that is involved in performative works from Singaporean artists, because that is the way they're responding to the system. Yeah.
No, those are great examples. Thank you, Annie. I mean, I think you're right. I can't add anything to that, but I didn't actually see or know about the example that you gave of I heard rumor, but I didn't include those kinds of examples. But I think you're right. It makes me think a little bit more that I shouldn't be so flippant and say, oh, they're not, intended to be political. It's not so much that as there had been some literature by scholars on the political aspects that seemed more superficial, like let's say political painting or something. I think performance art is so much more complex and deeper, and it can touch on those issues much more effectively in a way. And same with Lwin, you can't just say, oh, because he's yellow man means this. There's not like it's much more complex than that, because you're right, because it's all this about his body in relation to others, in relation to his nationality, his government, and he's always speaking against the government, Lwin, all the time. But I think you don't do justice if you do it in a very superficial way. So that's why I was thinking, okay, to just, like we probably know the same people who have written kind of about political art in Southeast Asia or activist art in Southeast Asia, being too casual about it and not really thinking about how deep and effective it actually is in the strategies that artists are using to be political without being recognized as political is also just as interesting.
I think though that with your idea of historiography, you are right on, spot on, no? Because history as being constructed in terms of representation, I mean that fits then all the parts, I think. Do we have time for one more question? Is that, what do you think?
We have a few minutes.
One more question, one urgent question, or just a fun question, whatever comes up. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Actually, all of your questions gave me lots of great material, so thank you so much. I'm going to write things down.
Okay, then we will wrap up.